Zack and I both did our homework and went through the list of the winners and losers in a bunch of different categories for the year. In streaming, in live music, record labels, artists.
Kendrick went from being your favorite rapper's favorite rapper to everybody's favorite rapper.
I'll give a shout out to someone that bowed out of the Drake and Kendrick Lamar beef, and that's J. Cole. J. Cole took a business decision that he was laughed at, and then in a post Not Like Us world, J. Cole looks like a genius. 2024 was not her year.
I mean, it's almost like she's trying to follow the Beyonce playbook and just the demand isn't there.
Love to hear your winner on the label side.
I went with the label group and I just went with Universal.
Well, this will be a fun one because I actually have them as my loser. My live winner would be AEG Presents. They promoted the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, and it's the biggest tour of all time.
My touring winner is your three favorite acts. My touring loser is everybody else.
The middle that just is getting squeezed, and I think that's also connected to my loser, which is the Coachella Music Festival. You're about to hear our winners and losers of 2024. If you listen to enough year-end recaps, they start to sound the same. You always hear these grand statements like, this was the craziest year that we've seen in a long, long time. And in most cases, I kind of roll my eyes when I hear some of that, but we also got to give 2024 some credit here, because there was some pretty wild stuff that did happen this year. If you want to see big mergers and acquisitions between some of the most influential companies in the space, some of them that went well, some of them that didn't, this is the year for you. If you want to see the biggest artists in the world doing their superstar thing, releasing albums, dominating on streaming, dominating in the live music circuit, this was also the year for you. If you also wanted to see the biggest companies in the space, the record labels, the streaming services, the social media platforms, try to find ways to work together, use their leverage, use their negotiation tactics, some much more successful than others, then this was definitely the year for you. To break it all down, we went through in 5 different categories and picked a winner and loser in each. We chose one in streaming, we chose one on the record label side, we chose one that's an artist specifically. We also looked at live music, we looked at M&A, and then we also picked a comeback player in the year. And joining me with this is my guy, Zack O Malley Greenburg, and we actually broke it up into 2 different episodes. So the first one that you'll hear, we talk specifically about streaming, record labels, and the artist, and then on our part 2 of our winners and losers, we talk more about live, M&A, and our comeback player of the year. This is a really fun one, and it's a great way to end the year on a high note. So I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Let's dive in. All right, we have our final episode of the year for Trapital, breaking down our winners and losers of 2024, and I'm joined by my guy, Zack O Malley Greenburg. Welcome back.
Thanks, and great to be here in real life, too, out in SF. A little home and home series. Yeah.
I know, exactly, like Jay and Eminem, right? So for the folks listening, Zack and I both did our homework and went through the list of the winners and losers in a bunch of different categories for the year. So to name some of them off, we're going to name a winner and loser in streaming. Artist, we're also going to do winner and losers for record labels, merger acquisition, and then a comeback player of the year. So we each picked one and we'll get to discuss, debate. I think in a lot of ways, this was the first true post-pandemic year that the industry had, and the number of deals, the number of moves that made definitely reflected that.
Absolutely. And, I should add the caveat that this is not a, let's say, scientific list. I went with my gut reaction, and then I sort of thought about it again, and I went back through my notes. The whole point is it's like a fun debate, right? So also you all should know that Dan and I did not discuss our picks with each other beforehand. So, maybe we'll get into it a little bit, or maybe we'll have all the same picks. Who knows? Yeah, we left it a little open-ended because some of these categories could be a company or a person, or, like a vibe even, or like a trend or something.
And I'm glad that you called out too that this isn't a pure metric or numbers based thing, because I didn't do it based on size necessarily. I think there are some things that were just too big to ignore that we definitely included, but there's a few things here. What was the impact? How was this company or how was this person beforehand, afterhand? What was the overall effect that it had? So yeah, we should get into it. So to kick things off, I'll let you start. Do you have a winner in streaming for 2024?
Yes. My winner in streaming for 2024 is Kendrick Lamar. And that's kind of a weird pick in some ways because, obviously Kendrick and Drake had this big beef. Everybody more or less, the consensus is that Kendrick won. Drake still had better streaming numbers in aggregate on the year, but Drake always has better streaming numbers than basically everybody every year. So the reason I picked Kendrick is because, the year over year improvement, Kendrick went from being, like your favorite rapper's favorite rapper to like everybody's favorite rapper. And that meant that he got a ton more streams. Not Like Us was, I think, the most streamed song in the world on Apple Music. Kendrick has always done well, but he's done better in, award ceremonies than he is done in streaming numbers traditionally, than he has done in touring numbers traditionally. Not that he's done badly in those categories, but now he's, mainstream, going to go and headline the Super Bowl halftime show, going to go out on a big stadium tour. Afterwards, Kendrick has always been Kendrick, super well respected and all that, but this was the year that from a streaming perspective, from a consumption perspective, he made, I think, the biggest leap of anybody.
It's hard to debate that. I'm glad you brought up the Apple Music numbers specifically, because hip hop has always done very well on Apple Music. They had so much of a focus early on, ironically, with Drake and giving him exclusive deals. So for the tables to turn in that type of way, I think was huge for him. I believe on Spotify, the song did really well too. So the song doesn't quite have 1 billion streams on Spotify yet, but I think it's right over 400 million, maybe around like 425 or so. So nearly half of the streams came from the United States, which is pretty big. That puts it up there with songs like Espresso or others that are just big songs that get pop play. I'm glad you did preface it, because technically speaking, Drake did have the better streaming year, and that's across platforms. But Kendrick, I mean, he balled out, and he's literally doing the most commercially successful thing that an artist can do. He is headlining the Super Bowl halftime show.
I almost thought of being really kind of controversial in picking Drake. I guess I would liken this to like revenue versus earnings. You could be a company that has a great deal of revenue, and you're just one of these like behemoths, but you're eking out like kind of a slim margin or something. And if you had a really great year, if your earnings go up, even if your revenue stays the same, you find a way to squeeze more out of what you were doing. So,
and how he cashed out on it too. He redid his deal with Interscope, so his whole post TDE chapter seems like it's been going very well so far, because people had some questions after Mr. Morale, right? For me, the streaming winner I picked, slightly different perspective with it, but I went with one of the streaming platforms, and I picked Spotify. Okay. And Spotify had its first full profitable year in 2024. The market cap had crossed $100 billion a couple months ago, at least in November. Right around the time of us recording this, it's probably around $90 billion or so. And that's up from $14 billion just in November 2022. So there's been a number of reasons why Spotify's been able to have that increase. Of course, they've been able to raise their prices, especially in the most developed markets. They also were able to continue to grow as well, and grow in ways that the major record labels did not grow, which was pretty surprising. So Q2 2024, that was probably the first year that we saw Spotify have growth in subscriptions that more than doubled, even tripled what we saw from Universal at the same point. So it led to this very interesting divide where Spotify is now celebrating the strongest year that it's ever had, and the major record labels have been in a much tougher situation in terms of the Wall Street and analysts being a bit more frustrated, be like, oh, well, why isn't your subscription revenue growing the same way that the major streaming platform that you rely on is? And that's because they're relying on other platforms and other stuff. But I think it really proved that Spotify's strategy ended up working. It did suppress prices, but that gave them tremendous pricing power, where now they have one of the stickiest subscription services that's out there. People are more likely to cancel Netflix or cancel other video services like that before they cancel their Spotify subscription. So, they're still not out of the clear. I think that some of the things like audiobooks and some of the other pushback that they've gotten from that, they'll need to figure out pricing there. I think that podcasting has definitely had its fair share of wins and losses for them. But when you look at the whole entire streaming landscape, the fact that their market cap of near $100 billion is more than the combined market cap of Universal, Warner, and if you were to hypothetically imagine what Sony's would be based on their market share compared to the market cap of those two, it would probably be equivalent, if not larger. Did not think that we'd be in that position at the beginning of the year.
I still remember when Spotify was coming over, from Sweden, and it was a push to, all the artists who came in as investors and, we're really pushing the Spotify narrative, and it kind of helped warm things up for the labels to cut deals. And, but, to go back 10 years really to around the time this was happening, you really got to credit the strategy, Daniel Ek, from the very beginning of kind of winning the hearts and minds of the artists, getting in the good graces of the labels, and then negotiating, to sell pieces of the company pre-IPO to the labels so that they would have a vested interest. And the labels, to their credit, realized that this would be a very good way, to own a piece of the streaming future. And I remember writing an article about this, which with my friend Nick Masidi, and we called it "The Revenge of the Record Labels" for Forbes back in, I think it was 2014, 2015. And, and we were basically, we detailed this sort of open secret in the industry that was happening, but we talked about how, it's a great business move, but it's not fair to the artists because the labels were negotiating, they were using the artists' intellectual property as this bargaining chip and not compensating them properly for it, right? I mean, they were cutting these kind of sweetheart deals, perhaps you could say, with Spotify on the streaming, and like that everybody's been complaining about for a decade. But they were getting equity, and the artists weren't getting a piece of that. And of course, as people began to realize what happened, the labels relented. They, promised some part of their IPO proceeds and so forth, and that eventually happened. But it all goes back to that strategy that the labels had to get in and have a piece of Spotify. But fascinating that, despite all the machinations, it's Spotify that has the bigger market cap or equivalent market cap to all the majors combined.
Right. I remember there was this point even a year ago where I would post these hypothetical questions to people that were insiders of the industry. Which of these stocks would you rather own? Spotify, Universal Music Group. Of course, Spotify had its IPO a few years back. Universal went public in 2021, and it was always split fairly. People would have these type of supplier versus retailer debates. And Bill Ackman, of course, famously, when he had invested when Universal Music Group went public, he had this whole presentation, and part of his thought was that I want to own the underlying capital light asset of Universal Music Group. I don't want to own the retailer in Spotify. But when the supplier can, or when the retailer rather, can just do a much better job of growing internationally, and I think the major record label strategy of trying to diversify its business with other companies that it could license its music to, that can help grow exponentially, that strategy works.
Yeah, and I think the modern consumer wants an unlimited buffet, right? And there are certain, whether it's Spotify for music, or I wouldn't call Netflix an unlimited buffet, because you can't just go on and get whatever movie you want or live TV. But I think visual media is still figuring that out. But remember, in the old days, it was like, oh, well, this artist is holding their stuff back and this one's not. And, that seems to have gone away. If you're going to pick one streaming service, if it's Netflix or Spotify, you're probably going to pick Spotify because you get all the music you want. There's like, 1% of the music that you can't find, or maybe 2 or 3%, depending on what your interests are. But whatever, for the most part, you can get everything you want, and you can't on Netflix or any other, video streaming service. So, I think that also speaks to the dominance of Spotify and why the stickiness of it, and why consumers would be willing to pay a little more.
On that note, let's talk about our losers.
All right,
who's yours?
I picked a streaming service. I picked Tidal. It's been about a decade since Jay-Z launched it with this, Avengers of music rollout. It was a great idea, and he who else could have gotten, all of those artists, from Coldplay to Kanye to Beyonce, obviously Rihanna, all on one stage, agreeing to support this streaming service. And if they had done it just a little earlier, right? If they had done it around the time Spotify had come over, I think Tidal could have won the war. And I think in many ways it was a better product. But if you have an unlimited buffet on Spotify, why are you going to go and be on Tidal? I mean, unless you're really an audiophile and you really, prefer the lossless or whatever. Block came in and bought, a huge chunk of Tidal, in recent months has announced that they're going to scale back their investment. There's been layoffs, and it's just the question is sort of like, what is the future of it? Jay-Z isn't pushing it like he used to. Where is there even room for anybody other than Spotify and Apple Music? And then where does Tidal fit into it? I don't know. So, the flip side of the coin of Spotify, to some extent, is Tidal.
So Spotify launches in the US 2011, and then 2015 is both the year that Tidal comes out, but it's also the year that Apple Music comes out.
Yeah.
And then, even though it's still fairly nascent in streaming, those 4 years make a big difference, because at that point, Spotify already has more than 10 million paid subscribers at that point, and you're getting the early adopters that are also the people that are sharing with others. And unlike Apple Music, unlike Tidal, Spotify was the one that didn't do any of these exclusives early on. So I do think that bet on where a lot of those platforms saw audio going was the wrong bet, essentially. And it was tough to kind of, see that in the moment. I remember even things that I wrote at the time thinking like, oh yeah, well, this is how you do it. This is how Tidal's going to do theirs. And I mean, Lemonade was exclusively on Tidal for 3 years, which sounds crazy to think about now. But all of those artists, whether they had done the exclusives with Apple Music, or they did the exclusives with Tidal, or they just had their music off of Spotify altogether, thinking about even artists like Adele or Taylor Swift at one point, all of them eventually came back, right? And so I think it's tough. And I think similarly to you, my loser in streaming wasn't necessarily a specific company, but the companies that only have a paid tier in streaming. So specifically looking at Apple Music, but also looking at Amazon, but also looking at, Tidal and some of the others as well by extension, because I think what helped Spotify from a growth perspective and what also helped YouTube from a growth perspective, which we should talk about, is the fact that they all had free tiers, Spotify and YouTube specifically. That was the best conversion for them, being able to get paid subscribers. And I understand that the major record labels don't like the free tier for obvious reasons. It just takes so much longer and harder for them to get compensated from it. The long game did end up working in the favor, and Spotify and YouTube are now the two largest contributors to the recorded music industry as a result of that. So I do think that some of those more constrictive strategies with some of those platforms did make things a bit tough. And then you add on the fact that both Apple and Amazon as parent companies are more Western world focused. The rest of the world is on Android and using WhatsApp. We're the ones over here in the US that are using iMessage and Apple. And there's similar things where there's such a strong density in the US of Amazon Prime subscribers. So in some ways, I feel like some of those things were naturally going to hit a ceiling regardless. We should move to artist on this note. Yes. So an artist, winner or loser. I'll start with one. So I'll give a shout out to someone that bowed out of the Drake and Kendrick Lamar beef, and that's J. Cole. So J. Cole took a business decision that he was laughed at about the time when he had put out that diss record against Kendrick Lamar, and then few days later at one of his concerts, he was like, hey, I just had a bad vibe in my heart. I don't want that out there. And he was ridiculed for it. People were like, we've never seen anyone do this in a rap beef before. But he stood on his business, he backed out, and then in a post Not Like Us world, J. Cole looks like a genius with this thing, right? He's always been someone that's kind of like popped in and out of music however much he wanted to. He never struck me as someone that wanted to be like a quote unquote mogul in the traditional way, but he's still commercially successful and has kind of been able to do things on his own terms. Okay, you want to, try to have a professional basketball career at 35 years old? Bet, you can join a league in, I forget which country it was in Africa, but maybe he was in 2 different leagues at one point, but, he tried that. Like, that's kind of cool, to be able to just do that. Him and his manager that is head of Dreamville, Ibrahim Hamad, they had done this 10-part podcast series called Inevitable, where they were talking about each step in J. Cole's career and just reminiscing on particular points and just turning points that they've had along the way. And he also had a tour this year that went very well from an arena tour perspective. He just redid his Dollar in a Dream thing in Madison Square Garden, where he had a few thousand tickets that he only sold for $1. He wanted to do all of them, but they like said, no, this is going to be madness. You can't do that. So he had a portion of them for that. He put a bunch of his mixtapes out on streaming. He did the 10-year anniversary for 2014 Forest Hills Drive. So definitely not the most commercially successful year, but considering where things started for him, I think it's been in a good spot for him. I can't say I agree with Forbes ranking him as the 4th greatest hip hop artist of all time, but that is a separate category. I still think he's done his thing.
Love J. Cole. I was not involved in that decision. I haven't worked there for years. And maybe I should put out my own list of 50 because people keep asking me about that, and I'm like,
do they? Just because I remember I texted it to you. I was like, I'm glad you're no longer involved in this.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I should put out my own top 50. No, I think that's a great one, and imagine how commercially successful he would have been this year if he had gotten involved, if he'd stayed in. But no, I think taking the high road was a great move, and I wrote a piece about this on the Zog blog, and I said, the real winner of the beef is J. Cole, and I think that was like a couple of weeks in when things were starting to get like kind of ugly, and now that the dust is settled and Kendrick Lamar is doing the Super Bowl, I don't know, it's probably Kendrick, but no, I like the J. Cole pick, and it's funny you say that because a few days ago I was walking through Union Square, and there's just like line of people. And then I turned left down the next block, and the line stretched around, that end of the block. And then I got to the end of that block and stretched around the other side. And so finally I just asked somebody, I was like, hey, what's going on here? And the guy's like, J. Cole tickets. This was the Dollar in the Dream tour. So, yeah, I mean, that's a really good deal for tickets, but still to get people to come out in person and, in the rain and like wait around the block, you've got to be really relevant. And so I think it's really cool, what he's done with that. And I think he comes out, certainly better than Drake from this whole situation, but I think it's a great pick.
Who's yours?
My pick is kind of boring, but it's Taylor Swift. Yeah.
I mean, it had to be addressed in some way.
She grossed over $1 billion this year. That's crazy. I mean, that's like unprecedented. I mean, it's more than double the number 2 act of the number 2 highest grosser, which was Coldplay, and they're doing stadiums all over the world. But yeah, I mean, it's bonkers. And she was the most streamed artist, and she had the new album and everything, and like have multiple albums in the top 10. I mean, she's just crushing everybody. And, commercially, it's just, I mean, it's like a Super Bowl every time she goes somewhere. And I remember in October, my wife and I were going to South Florida for her high school reunion. And I was like, why are these freaking airplane tickets so expensive? Why is it costing so much to stay at this dopey like Airbnb? And then we got there and I'm like, why is my car not, why can I not have the car that I reserved? There were no cars at the rental counter. Like the reservations are like, yeah, why don't you come back in a few hours?
Was this in Miami?
We were flying into Fort Lauderdale, and it turned out that Taylor was doing 3 nights in Miami, which is, it's like pretty close, but we weren't even flying into Miami. And it was like a Super Bowl. I mean, truly, and we got to our Airbnb, which was like in this condo building, and it was swarmed with tween girls in sparkly clothes, like attire and friendship bracelets. And I mean, it was like a giant Halloween sparkly costume party. It was wild. And, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised. I write about this, like you write about this. But there's something about sort of like accidentally stumbling into it. And you hear all these stories about the Taylor Swift impact on the local economy and Taylor Swift inflation and, single-handedly, whatever. And you're like, yeah, I don't know. Is that really true? But it's true. It's crazy. I've never experienced an artist who has become like the Super Bowl everywhere they go, especially for this long. Hats off. Like, well done. I mean, I feel like every year I do a winners and losers column, and she's on it. I mean, she just keeps going. So she's the main game in town.
it would be wrong if we did an episode like this and didn't acknowledge it in some type of way, right? So I'm glad you did. I'm pretty sure that the Torture Post Department had 1 billion streams in its first 5 days. Yeah. She kicks off the year by winning her 4th album of the year, more than any other artist, and everything on the touring side too. Plus, when her major record label has a dispute with the large entertainment platform in TikTok, she goes around them and says, I'm going to do a direct deal with you. And that essentially ends any of the leverage that the record label has. And then the record label's then like, okay, now we'll do a deal with you, TikTok. When have we seen leverage like that? And to be fair, like, it's not just Taylor that has that. I think a lot of things have shifted in the streaming and social media era that give artists more power, but she's definitely at the top. And that plus everything you said on the touring side this year, it's hard to not have that mentioned as the top move, and or just the artist that's making the top moves this year.
Yeah, and really in a country where people can't agree on anything, where you know the macroeconomic conditions include all kinds of inflation and right, like people are still shelling out. I mean, I looked just for fun when we were in Miami. It was $1,000 just to get into the to the nosebleeds in the stadium, and and that's in Miami. That's not even in New York, right? Like it's not it's not as expensive as New York or SF or LA, but yeah, I mean there's some magic that she has that transcends all these other factors. Right.
One of the few billionaires I can think of that doesn't get the late stage capitalism criticisms that most billionaires get.
Right. Yes, indeed.
So on a different note, talking about losers for the year, this person has definitely had their L's talked about quite publicly, so I'm not talking about anything new here, but Jennifer Lopez had a pretty rough year for a number of reasons. So she has this big comeback that she's planning with her This Is Me Now album. Of course, it's a play on her album 20 years ago, This Is Me, or This Is Me Then. So she has that, but the album flops. She tries to go on an arena tour. The arena tour does not sell, and the tour ends up canceling. She tried to get this musical off the ground that she ended up putting out on Amazon. She couldn't get financing for it, so she puts it out herself. She spends $20 million of her own money to do that, plus the documentary. That doesn't end up doing the best either. And then, of course, on the personal side, there's the divorce as well. I think she is someone that has obviously made a lot of commercially successful music. She's someone that still, seems to generate interest in any of the Peacock movies or rom-coms or things like that she's done. And I'm sure she'll probably bounce back as well. This is someone that kind of has 9 lives when it comes to entertainment. Anytime she's been down, she kind of comes back and has another hit with Pitbull, or she has another moment like Hustlers, or does the Super Bowl. So I'm sure she'll probably have another moment, but 2024 was not her year.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like she's trying to follow the Beyonce playbook, and she's just not Beyonce, and she's really great in a lot of different ways, but she just is like always going for that next level, and just the demand isn't there in the way that is for really not very many artists, right? I mean, you could probably count on 1 or 2 hands the artists who can follow that playbook and have people engage with the content, right? And J-Lo just isn't one of them. Like, she can do rom-coms, she can do Vegas residency, like that stuff does really well, I think. But taking that next kind of Beyonce level move just doesn't seem like there's quite the demand for it.
And I think too, because I watched the documentary as well, obviously there's a tremendous amount of self-belief and ego that you need to have for anyone to succeed at this level. Yeah. But I think there's a cohort of these Gen X artists that are in their 50s that are trying to still have this moment of being like, okay, I can do the next thing and it'll be just as big as whatever I did in the 90s. I put LL Cool J in that category as well. Yeah. And it's like, even if the music hits, like I did like LL Cool J's album, it's just not going to be the same type of impact.
Yeah, and I think another thing with J-Lo, and let's compare her to Taylor Swift for a second. Taylor Swift has this I mean, I know I said magic before, but it's a magical ability to simultaneously like project underdog and winner, and she is obviously she's this like the biggest star on the planet. I think J-Lo I mean, like, yes, she brings you into her world, but she doesn't really feel like an underdog. And it's just that but maybe it's like a prior generation's blueprint for being a celebrity, and you kind of like gloss over some of the, you know, the rougher parts of your story, of what you're going through, and try to project this, you know, victorious persona, and you know, like, I think the fans want you to explore your losses and your grief like a little more deeply. But then again, I guess J-Lo really did. She kind of did open the door she opened the door to her life with a lot of this stuff. But you know, it felt a little more like Hollywood.
Yeah. No, it definitely felt like going through like, oh yeah, here's me, you know, talking to another celebrity. Let's have Fat Joe come through. Oh, you know, Fat Joe, you and I were always close, kind of growing up together, you know, BX for life kind of thing, you know? So it's like...
Don't get me started on Fat Joe and the Yankees curse.
I will.
Fat Joe might be the loser of the year for that. Oh, Fat Joe, why did you do that?
Oh, man.
My loser is Diddy. I mean, yeah, like, that's like a much darker loser, obviously, and like more personally reprehensible type of situation. Obviously not trying to, you know, put the two of them together, although they have been lumped together historically, romantically, etc. Even though he came into the year with, you know, I think by the beginning of the year, we had seen the hotel video already come out, and, you know, things had started, like advertisers, companies were starting to distance themselves from him. But the extent to which it's cascaded, I mean, even at the beginning of 2024, would you have expected to see, you know, him end the year incarcerated with just a flood of other legal actions coming out? And I don't think so. So I can't think of a sharper fall from grace and wealth and status, and, you know, than his. And you know, there's still a lot to unfold, but I don't see any way he's coming back from any of this. It's going to be, it's pretty, you know, pretty grim.
Yeah, no, that's a good one to call out, because I think even the last time you and I have recorded an episode where we were talking about Diddy, I think we still felt like we don't know how things are going to play out. Like, not up in the air in terms of the allegations, but more up in the air in terms of like, what does the post-career look like after this point? Because just didn't know. But like you said, things just piled on. And I think for me, one of the telling points, as subtle as this was listening to one of the old school hip hop radio stations out here, and Mo Money, Mo Problems came on, and they took out his verse from it. Wow. And that's when I was like, okay, if you're now in that level, that's the R. Kelly zone where no, like Lady Gaga's going to re-record her song with Christina Aguilera instead of you. And like, that's the zone that we're in with this stuff, right? People wanting to see the quote unquote Diddy list, end quote, you know?
Right. And, you know, and of course, it's interesting as a producer, right? He had a hand in so many different songs and albums, and those are still going to get played. But, you know, but yeah, that's a good point. He's getting the R. Kelly treatment. It's a pretty horrendous situation, and it's, you know, we knew that he was bombastic, and obviously, you know, there's a specter of violence that trailed him from the City College situation, you know, through like some of the things like throwing kettlebells at football coaches and sort of laughed off. And it's like, but how did none of this stuff come out during Me Too or anything? And
for sure. So switching gears to labels, love to hear your winner on the label side.
So I maybe cheated a little bit, and I went with the label group, and I just went with Universal because when you run down and you know, really, if we wanted to go and say like Interscope or Republic, I mean, we could also do that, or some of the sub labels, but just if we take a step back and look at what Universal did on the whole, the number of artists that they have. I mean, if you name basically any, like who are the biggest acts right now, right? I mean, Taylor Swift we talked about, Billie Eilish, Olivia Rodrigo, you know, I don't know, Post Malone, Drake and Kendrick are both on Universal. The fact that they're like supplying both sides of the conflict, right? They're and obviously there's an interesting intramural lawsuit happening there, brought by Drake around some of the practices. around the label, like bumping up Kendrick's numbers and stuff. But wow, what a wild scenario to be able to be on both sides of that beef, and no matter who wins, you're making money. So I mean, yeah, hats off to Universal and some of the numbers that the gaudy numbers that they're putting up, but just I think it was being on both sides of Drake and Kendrick that did it for me, honestly. Even though that's not, I mean, Taylor Swift is probably a bigger deal than that whole conflict put together, but to have that kind of just total clout in the market, that's why I went with Universal.
Well, this will be a fun one because I actually have them as my loser. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, this will be a
Let's
fun
go.
one. It's interesting because on one hand, I agree with everything that you said in terms of between them and any of the majorly successful artists. They had a high share of them. A lot of them are under their record label and various sub-labels that they have. I think the thing that felt tough for Universal this year was that, one, their growth started to slow, and that was a clear impact of them not just relying on Spotify, but also relying on these other platforms that kind of stopped growing in that kind of way. Especially the streaming growth definitely took a hit there. And in general, it does feel like they have been having a bit of a tougher time developing their own superstar artist acts. So, because now they're in this point where they have to offer the most lucrative artist-friendly deals in the world to maintain these people. I've read Robert Kinsel had recently did an interview. He's the head of Warner Music Group. They don't want to do a lot of these crazy artist-friendly deals just for the sake of market share. When I look at the numbers that I've heard, whether it's through the grapevine on the Taylor Swift deal, the Drake deal, the Kendrick deal, the Weeknd deal, they have a lot of those artists, but the terms just, don't necessarily line up the best from a financial perspective. So I wonder, how long does that last for them with that model, especially when a growing share of music that is commercially successful is coming from the non-major labels. So it's kind of these things where both of these things end up being true, where a lot of the music that I listen to, they still control, but from an overall business perspective, it does seem like things are shifting in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense, and that's been another, overarching narrative of music, right? It's like things are not as good for the labels; they're better for the Spotify's of the world. But to me, I think when you think about, why does Universal want market share? It's not just for the bragging rights, right? It's the financial incentives to having the largest market share mean you get a bigger piece of things like the black box, right? All these unclaimed royalties for artists whose names are misspelled and streaming and things like that. There are these underlying financial advantages to being the biggest player by far, and I would have to go through their financials to break that out and really get into the numbers, but just I think that's something that gets overlooked, right? It's not just bragging rights. It's you just get some free money basically. I mean, I don't know. We've been talking about how we don't need labels anymore. For how long have we been talking about? How many? Certainly my whole career.
I definitely don't agree with that sentiment. Yeah, I don't agree with that sentiment. Yeah.
So but I think that there's always been, certainly since the rise of streaming, it's what artists are going to fund themselves and and that happens, but at some point most of them come over to big label and and then they want to be a part of a Universal or a Warner or a Sony, and so I would still I would just rather be the leader, the market leader, and get all those advantages that you get with your percentages of the black box and things like that. Headwinds aside, I think that to me is why I put them up there.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
Who do you have for your loser?
I picked Atlantic.
Yeah.
And again, think about the beginning of the year. Atlantic was run by Julie Greenwald and also Craig Coleman, but he's kind of the head music guy, and she was sort of the chief operator. But Julie's an icon, right? I mean, an absolute icon in the business. A ton of other, well-respected veteran executives. And then, this summer there was just this huge restructuring that ended up with Julie leaving, a bunch of others, including Kevin Lyles, some other, folks who we've talked to a lot over the years. And, and of course you have Elliot Grange coming in, the son of Lucian Grange, of course, chief of Universal. And, his experience had been running an indie and, I'd had some successes there, but, nothing on the scale of the types of artists that we're talking about at a place like Atlantic. So like the Warner Music Group strategy maybe with Atlantic in particular is, trying to run it more like a startup, more like an indie than, a legacy brand. And like you cut some of the costs and you get scrappy and, like new era music, but kind of model. But, I don't know. I think it's kind of like the worst of both worlds. If you're a big legacy record label, like you got to use that to your advantage. And I don't think you're gonna win the scrappy war. You're gonna, if you're Atlantic, like you wanna lean on your heritage and like Ahmet Erdogan and like all these great stories of the music legends of yore and today. I mean, they have like Bruno and Coldplay and a lot of really good folks on there. So I think that's pretty that's a pretty rough transition. We'll see. Obviously, Elliot comes from a great pedigree. He's going to have to defy this sort of nepo baby narrative and show that he can do it on his own and that he's got his doing it from his own merit. But I just think it's really tough to lose that level of experience and Julie would be. I would not have thought going into the year that Julie would leave before, let's say, retiring. It just. That's why I picked Atlantic as loser.
So the losers not because of Atlantic's performance so far, losers because of the personnel decisions that Warner made about Atlantic.
Yes. Correct.
Okay, got it. Interesting, because I considered giving them the same, but for the opposite reason. Because of the performance. This was at one time one of the label groups or sub-label groups that was, right up there with Interscope and Republic, like competing for the top one. And in many ways, people looked at as one of like the big ones that people often like looked up to, right? Yeah. That has not been the case. And you've seen that market share lose, several percentage points year over year. So when I see that, I'm like, okay, I understand that there can be a call for me wanting to see some type of change. Like I do get that, even though there are like legends there that have been working there and, that whole crew, Michael Kaiser and others as well that have been part of the crew there. I do understand that there had to be change. And then when I was looking at it by artists. You mentioned Bruno and Coldplay earlier. Bruno's interesting because, he's had some singles here and there. I know he has a few on the radio right now with like Apt and like really the big. Die with a Smile, but he hasn't released a solo album since 2016. Yeah. And I know that he had the Silk Sonic one with Anderson .Paak, but Cardi B, I mean, we're waiting on that next album like we're waiting on Dre to drop Detox at this point. I mean, she's just been pushing this thing off for however long. Yeah. I mean, Ed Sheeran does his thing. I'll give him that. Yeah. And, they have like newer folks. Like I'm pretty sure Charlie XCX is on Atlantic as well. So it's one of those things where I do get the need to make a change. And if anything, I was probably going to put them there because I'm like, you being one of the top labels and then now being in this, position is definitely tough. How they've went about making the change, it's tough because on one hand, I do understand that if you're like, okay, if you want to have this legacy label, not just, go the way of like other legacy labels like Capitol, for instance, and others, how do you like have this thing be strong? Okay, bring in some new blood, bring in some younger blood to do things their way. And, he has had wins with 10K projects, whether it's Ice Spice or some of the others. But Yeah.
Yeah, but can you do it on the grand scale? And
that's the question.
It's
right?
a totally different skill set, and maybe he can do it. But it's, to go back to my Yankees, right? Like, the Yankees shouldn't be playing Moneyball. I mean, you should be smart with your money, right? But you should flex your Yankee muscles, and people play Moneyball because they have to play Moneyball.
Yeah.
Right. Like small market teams play Moneyball because that's their only option. And if you're the Yankees, like, you need a little shock and awe, and you with some analytics, and be smart about it. But so I think that's like the Atlantic and the Universal are the two sides of the same coin. Like, Universal should be. Atlantic should be trying to be Universal, or let's say Republic or Interscope, not trying to be whatever indie label, right? Like, the Yankees should try to be the Yankees, not the Oakland A's, right?
Yeah.
The Red Sox should try to be the Yankees, not the Oakland A's.
And I think the nuance there, which I'm glad you brought up that analogy, is that if Atlantic, and by extension the parent company Warner, is like, we don't want to give the type of deals that Republic and maybe even Interscope are giving, where they're not calling it by name, but they're like, hey, we're not going to do those type of deals, then if Atlantic's the Yankees, and they're not going to be we'll give you Juan Soto level money, right? If they're like, that's their whole strategy. So it's like, part of it's like, okay, well, is that the right strategy? Like, because it's great that you have Bruno, Cardi, but if all the other superstars are staying at Universal, but everyone's just criticizing the deals, being like, oh, well, you're just giving these, like artist-friendly, skinny distribution deals. We don't want anything to do with that. Well, you're also losing market share. I know that counters something that I said earlier, but I think it just kind of paints like a full picture of like what's going on here.
I mean, I agree. I agree more with what we just said.
Yeah, I know. This whole back and forth, it'll be interesting to see how all this develops. Yeah. Did we get everything on the label side, or was there one other?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay.
We got all yours, yeah.
So I guess, I should talk about the winner then. Mine was collectively like the non-major record labels in the space. I think they've just continued to gain market share and growth, and specifically some of the ones in other countries too. That's why you see more acquisitions. That's why you've seen more deals like that. Part of the growth of these global music streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube is because there's so much success that these other areas are having outside of the Western world, thanks to streaming. So them being able to have businesses that they weren't able to have, elsewhere, I think, is pretty strong. And of course could pick, different companies here, but I'm mostly thinking of ones outside of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a sort of recurring theme in our winners and losers. There's this kind of middle, there's like mushy middle.
Monetizable mid.
Monetizable mid. That's right. Like sometimes if you're Drake, maybe you could do it, but that there is this sort of mushy mid that it's very hard to operate in. Like, if you're not winning, but also you're not sort of like seat of the pants, scrappy, and like doing, really well in terms of margins, you're just kind of in this mush, and then you got to figure something else out.
Right. No, I'd agree with that. We should switch gears to live. My live winner would be AEG Presents. So that's a unique one because I think, of course, I could have went the Live Nation route. I think that's a bit obvious. They just had a pretty strong year, but went with AEG specifically because they promoted the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, and it's the biggest tour of all time. And even though promotion itself is a pretty smaller margin business compared to ticketing and other things, that's, if there's any tour to be promoting, there's that one. And they also acquired this other company that's Latin American based in their music. It's called Cardenas Marketing Network, and they've done stuff for Bad Bunny and Don Omar and some of the other artists too. And you're just seeing the global reach and impact of live music. So I think it's the way to go, and I think we're going to continue to see things like that.
I think that's a great pick. I think the Taylor Swift angle is spot on. I thought about AEG. I thought about Live Nation too for this category, but you could also argue that they're a loser because the government is coming to try to bust them up as of this year. This kind of been going on, historically, periodically the government, is just trying to do something there, but with the whole Live Nation Ticketmaster scenario, but But yeah, no, I think AEG is a great pick.
We'll see how the Live Nation Ticketmaster thing plays out. But yeah, what's yours?
Well, I want to give my winner and my loser together. So
Okay.
let me hear your loser, and then I'll give you both.
My loser is also AEG Presents owned Golden Voice Run, Coachella Valley Music Festival.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's a good. Yep.
That is my loser.
Right. The year that the festival boom died. Right. I mean,
at least in the U.S.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Should I go into mine and we'll discuss them all together, or do you want to?
Yeah, if it's connected, you can go into yours and we
yeah.
can discuss them.
So my touring winner is your 3 favorite acts, and my touring loser is everybody else.
Okay. Yeah.
And not you, Dan, but
yeah.
you, whoever you are, right? Like, and my reasoning for that is, unless you work in the business, which actually a lot of the listeners here do, so fine. But, if you're not getting tons of free tickets, or if you're not, fabulously wealthy, and you like music, now you're going to go to your 3 favorite acts, because it's gotten so freaking expensive. If one of your 3 favorite acts is Taylor Swift, there's $1,000 a ticket if you're seeing her even in your own city. And if you're not, then you're paying double for the airfare. You're paying double for the hotel on the weekend that she's in town. But you go down the list. If your favorite artist is Olivia Rodrigo, the average ticket is $500-$600. Even Morgan Wallen is up there. You think country is usually a little cheaper, but he's also, up in that range. Costs are elevated. Inflation is real. Cost of living is higher than it was, and and to an extent, I think the touring prices reflect that. But also, I think it reflects this just scarcity. Right? There's only one Taylor Swift, and people are willing to pay whatever to go see her. So the average person has less disposable income to go see concerts, and the concerts are more expensive. You have to make hard choices. And I think that's why we're seeing the J-Los of the world have to cancel their tours, and that makes sense, because there's like a pre-pandemic world where it's like, what are you doing Saturday? Oh, J-Lo's in town. You want to go see, like, how much are the tickets? Oh, they're $80 like for upper deck, whatever. Fine. It'll be fine. But now they're more expensive, and it's like, do you really want to shell out, like, like, I don't know, somebody who and you kind of hear their stuff on the radio, but you're not a super fan. Are you really going to shell out a couple $100 to go see them and to sit in crappy seats? No, it's just not. It's not worth it, and you'd rather save that and put that towards seeing, whoever it is that you actually really care about. And so that's why I say the winners are your 3 favorite bands, and the losers are everybody else. And you're seeing this, and it's a crazy amount of festivals got canceled, right? And these sort of, like, it's this mushy middle of touring that's really suffering. Of course, if you live in a great live music city, you can always go down to wherever, to the local spot and see whoever is in town. And you weren't going there because of them anyway. You were going because of the venue, and you're like, this is a great venue, and I would just love to roll the dice and see who's ever there, and I'll pay $20 to get in, and that's great. So I think that that's still that.
Right.
And the tippy top is still the tippy top, but I think people are just making, are being a little more, choosy with their dollars now.
Yeah.
Live.
No, I think that's right. It's like everything you said about the middle that just is getting squeezed as well. And then all those acts, their costs are going up, right?
Yep.
Production, all of that,
Yep.
Inflation, everything is hitting them. So I think in a pre-pandemic world, there was kind of this written thing of, okay, if you're doing nightclubs, or if you're doing, sub 100 capacity venues, you may not make money on that tour, but when we go back and we hit the ones that are a couple thousand, then we can start making money, develop your touring product, and go from there. But now there's acts that are doing those, and they're still not able to make money. So it just raises the levels, and it's just this, like, power law distribution that didn't frankly exist in that same way in touring. So it's been fascinating to see. And I think that's also connected to my loser, which is the Coachella Music Festival, because Coachella's peaked run was definitely the 2010s, that pre-pandemic time, because they had the biggest artists that were starting to transition more into pop music, but you still had the biggest rock acts wanting to come, and every year felt like it its own moment, whether it was, having Dr. Dre and Snoop that one year, or Outkast, or Beyonce, or Radiohead, whoever it was, there was always these big acts. But then now, especially in the past couple of years, the way things have went with touring, the superstars, the demand for them, for everything that you said, the demand for them is so high that it doesn't make financial sense for them to even do Coachella. Right. Because Taylor Swift can do SoFi Stadium in Inglewood and make $17 million gross, and from what she does just from one night. It's probably not too different for Beyonce or some of these other artists that are performing at SoFi. You go to Coachella, maybe they're paying the headliners $4 or $5 million per weekend for the top ones. So are you really going to do twice the amount of work for even less pay? So now you're getting the artists where that makes financial sense for them to do, right? So then it's the artists that can do arenas in big cities, or it's artists that can do a few arena shows in big cities, or maybe even they may do one stadium show themselves, but it's either a legacy act or it's no longer that tip-top act. And that's why some of the reports on why did Kendrick Lamar reportedly turn down doing Coachella this upcoming year in 2025, or even Rihanna, it's because they're doing their own other stuff, and Kendrick Lamar himself doing his own tour that's going to be in SoFi Stadium in 2025. So they really got squeezed in a way economically, which I probably didn't see coming, frankly, in 2017, 18, especially when Beyonce, put on this like documentary worthy performance of her headlining set in Coachella. Things just changed quickly. Yeah, and this phenomenon of the superstars becoming super duper stars, right? Like, are we at peak superstar? I mean, we're in a new frontier here. Taylor Swift can sell 180,000 tickets over a weekend at three stadium shows. That's a music festival, right? Like 3 nights, 180,000 tickets. Why do you need anybody else? And there are a few acts that can do that. Yeah, it just takes the wind out of the sails of a big festival like that. And further, if you're picking between a few, and you're like, I'm going to do one big music splurge, and I'm a Swiftie, like you're just not going to spend that on Coachella. You're just going to do your Taylor Swift trip. Right. And you've seen that play out with Coachella having slower sellouts and things like that. No knock to anyone that is performing at these shows. And I think some of these Coachella criticisms apply to Bonnaroo. They apply to Outside Lands. They apply to Lala. Like, all of them have some aspect of this in general. Are live winners and losers. You want to start? I thought that we just did. No, that was live. M&A. That's what I meant to say. Are M&A winners and losers? Okay. M&A, there are a lot of big deals. Yeah. Right. Like a lot of B2B deals. There were a lot of artist catalog sales. Surprising, I thought, given that interest rates are still fairly high compared to where they were during that crazy catalog boom a couple of years ago. But I picked Michael Jackson, or the Michael Jackson estate. This is going to be fun to talk about. Yeah. So, and this deal, it got some press, but it happened at the beginning of 2024, toward the beginning. And so the estate sold half of MJ's catalog for $600 million, valuing the whole thing around $1.2 billion. It was slightly bigger than the total deal that Queen got, which was also around $1.2 billion for the Queen's entire catalog. But Queen, or Queen estate, got the payment now. Like, they didn't hang on to half of it. And so that's kind of why I picked MJ / the MJ estate as the winner there, because they got so it's the highest valuation of an individual catalog ever, right? In a deal, I'm pretty sure. The Michael and Queen ones are pretty close. I forget which one. One maybe 1.2, one is 1.27, and granted, it's for half versus full, but yeah. MJ was more, and he was a competitive guy, and I know John Branca, who was his lawyer for many years, and co-executive of the state. I know that he's a competitive guy too, and so I think Michael would have wanted that, but the way it shook out, I think he's somewhere up there, like thinking about like, hey, I got that, still got that, but I think being able to hang on to half of the catalog is a really good move too, because
when we started seeing some of these catalog deals, like, 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, nobody's going to get more than that. You better sell it. And, and yet here we are. And the numbers are getting into the billions for individual catalogs. I think that, I think that's like a pretty impressive total. And, obviously Michael Jackson is super relevant and, and will continue to be, but it's not like his streaming numbers are up there with Drake and stuff after the Afterlife. And, let's say, I think probably we'd have to look at this. I think Queens are higher than MGs.
Yeah, Queens, because I looked this up as well, because I'll get into it. But yeah, I think Queen gets more streams than Michael Jackson.
Yeah. And, obviously Michael Jackson has been surrounded by controversy for a long time. And so to still get that number, I mean, for all those reasons, like, that's a pretty impressive feat.
And I'm pretty sure that number was higher at one point too, because I think there was some report a couple of years ago where the 50% stake was rumored around being 900 million and the total valuation was around 1.8. Who knows if there was something that was like not included in that, but I in general, these are still, two of the more valuable ones, at least for the artists that released a lot of their stuff in the, 70s for Queen and then in the 80s for Michael, at least for the most valuable stuff. Yeah. So your winner is the Michael Jackson estate,
it's really
not Sony
estate,
though, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because that's an interesting. Because the reason I asked that is because my loser actually is going to be Sony in this category, because they spent over $2 billion on Queen, Michael Jackson, and Pink Floyd this year, and I have to wonder how the ROI on that is going to play out. And not that I'm not necessarily like bearish on catalogs overall, but I know that the streaming numbers aren't necessarily the best if you're looking at things purely on the value of the recording asset. If you're looking at the publishing or some of the others, you're trying to base it off of what you can maximize there. And there's been so many talks about a Michael Jackson biopic movie. At this point, I'm a bit skeptical on it happening just because of how massive everything is. I mean, that said, I think his musical has done very well on Broadway, and there's other things that, are part of the say. I don't know if that helps, but I'm sure that there's a bit of a halo effect with a lot of that stuff. Queen, though, is interesting because even if some of the other stuff is included, well, there's still a recent biopic. There's nowhere near enough time to like make another one. And granted, I think it's tough to find music from the 70s or 80s that can get billions of streams on Spotify or all platforms alone. So they definitely have that. Pink Floyd is interesting because on one hand, Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall are like two of the best like selling albums of all time. Those are like the physical LPs that people bought. Like their music really doesn't stream in that way. And I know that like IP would be a nightmare there because the group members don't even talk to each other, So I just wonder, I know that labels, again, talking about market share, this helps them, you sure up more back catalog in an era where it's so much of a gamble in terms of spending that $2 billion to acquire new talent, which of course they need to do on the front lines. But yeah, I just wonder, how the ROI of that's going to look, down the road.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm with you. I don't love these deals from Sony's perspective at all. And I think especially over the past, let's say, we'll lump in the prior catalog boom with this, so like over the past 5 years, like a lot of these huge catalog deals, and I would say most of them of these like 9-figure catalog deals have been old white guys, rockers. And, I get it. And a lot of the executives making these decisions are old white guys, and this is what they grew up on. But I mean, like, are there a lot of kids listening to Pink Floyd or Bob Dylan? Even Bruce Springsteen. I love Bruce Springsteen, but like, man, I remember a couple of years ago, I interviewed a gamer. I was writing a story about like one of the champion gamers. He's from New Jersey, and I was joking something about like I made some Springsteen reference, and he said, "Who's that?" And I was like, "You're from New Jersey, and you don't know who Bruce was 19 or something." I don't know.
That's hilarious.
I was like, "You don't know who Bruce Springsteen is, and you're from New Jersey? That's like being Catholic and not knowing who Jesus is. I mean, like, come on." And that's anecdotal. I know. and my 2.5-year-old daughter Riley loves Springsteen, especially Badlands. She's like Badlands. She loves screaming that out. But I don't know. A lot of these catalogs. I mean, we all know that hip hop is a dominant genre, and but like still to this day, some of these biggest deals are we're seeing. It's still Pink Floyd. It's still Queen. I think Queen has is more entrenched in like sports and arena bangers, like all of that. I could kind of see that standing the test of time longer. But Pink Floyd, like it's like you really like it's more sit down and listen and get into it, put on the vinyl.
It's the exact opposite of how music is consumed today.
Yeah.
No disrespect to their music, but
I think there's gonna be a lot of write downs on these catalogs 10 years or so down the line. So
yeah, I still think there are deals to be had in the catalog space, but I think I just have a different lane about how I would,
I mean,
I think there are ones worth 1.2 billion
sure.
and 6 billion or 600 million and 400 million, but yeah.
Yeah, and I know hip hop is kind of different because there's usually so many songwriters and
sampling
and all that. But I think like when we figure out which rapper people are going to be listening to, on the oldies channel or whatever, classic rock, classic hip hop. But we already have that. We're starting to have classic hip hop. As a genre that old fogies like us listen to, so
right.
I think that's really should be the next play, but we haven't really seen much activity there.
Yeah, no, we haven't. So there were your winner. Who's your loser?
My loser is Hypnosis. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so it's along these lines. Yeah.
So in the catalog boom of the past 5 years, there's really been no bigger player than Hypnosis, gobbling up all these catalogs. And if you talk to people, the artists were like, awesome, Hypnosis is driving up the value of my catalog. And if you talk to other people who are buying catalogs, they were like, I fucking hate Hypnosis because they're driving up the prices of all these catalogs and I can't buy any. And so they paid, I don't know, did Hypnosis overpay? I think in a lot of cases, yes.
Yes. I mean, it's like 30x multiples for certain stuff. And now in a market corrected, we're talking like 14, 18x is what most of these like acquirers are telling me that their like ranges for a more standard offering.
I think there were probably some deals. I mean, I think Merck started 2017 or something. So I think there were probably a few good deals in there that that went up, and but I saw the number. It was like 1.4, 1.5 billion for the whole thing.
Of what Blackstone acquired Hypnosis for.
Yeah.
It was like 1.5. It was somewhere around there.
Yeah. And, obviously there had been some legal wrangling going on recently. And, but I was like, that. I mean, obviously it's a big number in an absolute sense, but the artist, I mean, something like 45,000 copyrights on there. The artists, I mean, Red Hot Chili Peppers. I was going through the list the other day, and I was like, "Who isn't in this catalog?"
Yeah, it was a wide group.
And
they
it was
really
like entire
did.
catalogs, and like Timberland and Justin Timberlake, and right, like, and again, I don't remember which albums of who and what and which pieces, and some of it was a little more complicated and multiple songwriters, but there were a ton of copyrights in there, and like legit hits, so the kind of hits that we're talking about that aren't getting as much love maybe in sort of like long-term copyright view, and not as many like septuagenarian white rockers in there. And so I thought it was sort of like a really good mix, and I don't know that it got basically only a little bit more than just Queen or just MJ. That seems low, and you wonder if all of the shenanigans kind of added up and drove the price down, or I don't know. Maybe like, maybe it's a case where the fundamental philosophy of creating this big mush of assets, the whole is less than the sum of the parts, right? There's something about buying a catalog where somebody is placing a premium on, I have the catalog of this. There's only one Michael Jackson, or it's not really exactly true because it was only half, but let's say, for Queen, like we have the Queen catalog, there's only one, or, Bob Dylan or whatever it was. Maybe that's actually, you know, we've not talked about NFTs so much lately, but you know, there is that element of like, I own the ultimate one of one keepsake.
And it's a bit of a marketing thing at some extent, right? Like, even though these firms aren't record labels where they need market share, hence maybe why Sony is willing to pay that to bolster its back catalog and, you know, its own standing as a major record label group. These investment firms didn't have that necessarily. But if you're able to leverage and be like, oh, well, we have Neil Young, and Neil Young is like doing interviews as well with me, and you have Shakira or Darkchild or some of the other ones, Timbaland, I think was the early one. Yeah, they probably got a bit of that premium, similar to some like small market team that has to make a splash on some like A- or B+ level star and give them A+ level money because they were never the big market team to be able to get an A+ level star to begin with.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. Or, you know, it's like you're assembling an art collection and you're buying like Picassos and Rembrandts and whatever, but then you sell it as like the collection, you know? You're going to lose some of that marketing power. So,
yeah.
You know, I don't know. So maybe that puts a little bit of a kibosh on all of this music as an asset and asset class, and you know, it's finance thing. But then again, and we didn't even really get into this, but there were a ton of some of the biggest deals were just like B2B. You know, like we're talking. Yeah,
that's going to be one of my winners.
10-figure deals.
Yeah.
That involve people that the average music fan has never heard of. So you know, so I think that is alive and well, and perhaps surprisingly so, given the fact that interest rates are still pretty high.
My winner is so KKR, the investment firm. They acquired this company called Superstruct, and Superstruct is a live events company. They organize a number of music festivals, primarily in Europe and some in Australia too. I think it's over 80 of them. And they acquired the business for $1.3 billion. And I think for them, KKR, they had made a bunch of investments in the music rights space specifically. They pulled out of some of those investments towards the end of 2023. They did do an asset-backed security with Harborview Equity Partners in the winter or spring of 2024. But still, this was, I think, one of their bigger bets for this year. And even though I had my criticisms earlier about music festivals overall, I do think that European and music festivals outside of the US are in a slightly different category, because here in the US, like, everyone has optionality, everyone's so opinionated, but you talk to some of these artists, regardless of genre, they do better in terms of their tour and their revenue oftentimes in other parts of the world, and there's just more demand there because it's not like they are trying to reach the fan that is living in Manhattan or the fan that's living in LA, where they have options to literally everything. So your bar of what you're willing to go to raises, which makes Coachella have a bit of a tough thing. I think that the festivals in Europe and Australia are like not decades behind in terms of the quality, but in terms of the saturation of the consumer being as picky as the American, you know, coastal elite consumer. I'll throw Chicago in there as well. It's nowhere near as close. So I do think that there's some good upside to be able to capture from that. And looking at what some of the festivals, they're still getting like Charlie XCX and Chapel Roan to headline them and stuff like that. And yeah, that's the kind of artists we're talking about, right? Like, they're not going to, you know, headline 3 straight nights at SoFi Stadium, but yeah, I'm sure they probably take a, you know, 4 or 5 million euro check to go do one of these festivals run by a company like Superstruct.
That's a great point. Although, do you think at some point, you know, we are a global village, and the same trends that are affecting U.S. touring negatively are going to come around and you know, kind of weigh on that?
I do think it'll eventually happen, not in enough time that I don't think the economics for this deal would work out.
Yeah.
Because I still do think this type of deal, like the timing and everything now, works well, where it's like, all right, well, if you can capture that wave, then great. But I don't think it's going to happen in the next, like, you know, few years. I think it'll take some time.
Yeah. We barely talked about Chapel Roan or Charlie XCX, and we probably should have talked more about them. But, you know, to go back to the Moneyball comment, I mean, I would much rather have Chapel Roan or Charlie XCX on my team, like in a lot of ways, than some of the superstars we're talking about, because it probably is much more economical. And, you know, like that's the sweet spot for some of these labels. Like, if you can develop somebody like that. And that hot second before they have to get some enormous like $50 million a year kind of deal. It is like baseball, right? You want to develop the next Juan Soto instead of having to pay him to come join your team. So
right, and we'll see how that plays out for Warner and Atlantic in that kind of way, right? Especially with Charlie XCX, because if she's not getting the 8-9 figure deal at least yet, we'll kind of see how it plays out. Yeah. So yeah,
and that's actually another point. A side note on my Atlantic pick, they had Chapel Roan.
Yeah.
Oops.
Right. I know. It's funny how these things, sometimes these things take a long time, right? Even someone like Sabrina Carpenter, she's on this is her 6th album.
Yeah.
These people have been in the game for a while, right? Yeah. To close things out, our final one is our comeback player of the year. Who's your pick?
You could say runner up, but not really. And I'll tell you why. Was Hozier, because I love Hozier. He's one of my favorite interviews of all time. That album he came out with, Take Me to Church, was just transcendent. And he's really like one of the most introspective people you'll ever meet, talking about music and life and philosophy. Fellow Irishman, so always rooting for him too. But he's really freaking tall. He's like 6'6".
Oh wow!
And he's very spindly. It's but anyway, that's nothing to do with why he was my pick. He comes out with the Too Sweet, that great song that everybody now sings at karaoke, which I think feels as big as anything he's ever done. 10 years later or something, which is always hard to do. But then I realized that was last year, right? That was off of his 2023 album, and he's been doing very well off of it. But I couldn't, just in all honesty, pick it for 2024. So I'm going to go with Post Malone. And maybe that's a weird pick too, because he never really went away. Like, you're always hearing about Post Malone. But remember a few years ago, Post Malone was really in the center of the conversation all the time, for better or worse. But all of his albums are going to number one. He was sort of unavoidable. But then he had a couple albums that underwhelmed, or I don't think they were really in the conversation. And maybe it's Post Malone is not pandemic music, really. You want more, maybe you want more like Bon Iver or Taylor Swift, Evermore or something like that. You're spacing out, it's quiet, and but Post Malone is a little more active, being around people and partying music. But then he made this transition to country. And his album came out, I think it was in August. I remember listening to it. I was on this long train ride. I was like, I'm just going to sit down and listen to this album straight through. And I freaking loved it. It was great. And it's done really well. It's his first number one and first platinum album, I think, since 2019. And it seems to fit. It works. I think country had moved to a place that got closer to where Post Malone was, and then Post Malone moved closer to where country had gotten to. But I don't know. I like this album more than any other Post Malone album, and more than most country albums that I hear. And I just think it fits. It doesn't feel inauthentic. And it seems to be resonating. So Post Malone kind of finding his groove again. I'll give it to him.
Yeah, and speaking of Coachella, he's one of the headliners, right? It's him, Gaga, and Green Day. So, definitely found his lane there. And I know that he put a lot of work into just his whole touring product, and what is his touring agent. I came on the podcast a couple of years ago. So yeah, I'll give him credit. I still do like the Beer Bongs and Bentley's album. I think that's the one that was the name of that album.
Was that 2019? Yeah.
I think it was 2018, 19.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a good one. My comeback player of the year, not someone I thought I was gonna even name at the beginning of this year, but it's Nicki Minaj.
Oh,
and Nicki, because her Gag City World Tour, the Pink Friday World Tour 2, 4th highest grossing hip hop tour of all time. I think grossed 108 million from 70 different shows. And I call it a comeback because she tried to go on tour with Future in 2018-19 timeframe. This was after she released the Queen album, and the tour did not sell in North America. She ended up canceling the tour, although her and Juice WRLD did go on tour in Europe for that tour. But yeah, so her and Future together as a package, couldn't do it then. And if you would have asked me between that and then some of the public comments that came out, but you know, I didn't know that we would be in the spot. And if anything, I felt like this post-pandemic touring moment was kind of felt like a bit of a gamble, where I don't know if this artist is going to have one of the biggest tours ever, like, you know, she did in hip hop, or if it's going to go the way that J-Lo and the Black Keys did. It felt like artists were just trying to throw it at the wall. Hey, there's a boom here. People have been inside for 18 months. Let's see what we can do. And I think it worked out for her. She even came back to some of the cities and did her tour as well. And, you know, I think at an earlier stage in hip hop and in music, an artist that kind of followed that arc would have already had their peak. And although I think from a music perspective, me personally, I'm probably most of a fan of her music from, let's call it, you know, Beat Me Up Scotty to like the Pink Print. So you're talking like 10 plus years ago at this point. But, you know, she's still doing her thing, you know, and being unapologetic about it. So, you know, got to tip my hat.
Yeah, good pick. And indeed, a comeback from the COVID era Nicki Minaj memes to like where she is today, and you know, yeah, eternal and in her own way. And you know, she was also up on that list of top rappers, and you know, I think deserves consideration on any list of top rappers toward the top. You know, she's, man, like her verse on Monster, that was just really great.
Yeah.
Like she went at the top of her game. I don't think there's anybody better. So
yeah, I always feel like whenever people talk about like the big three, like in rap, especially from the 2010s, I think she gets left off of those, and it's hard to. Even if you want to make it like a big four, like I think it's hard not to include her. Like, I mean, after Drake and Kendrick, if you want to exclude someone like Kanye because he had came out the last decade, I mean, I think Nicki had a more commercially successful decade than anyone else that would be in that third bucket potentially.
Yeah, and Kanye's always tricky for a lot of reasons, but like, do you include him on a list because of his producing skills? If you're just talking about rappers, you know, and it's like if you take out the producing, it's like, you know, you take assists out of LeBron's game. Like, is he still in your top in your top three or whatever? You know, I don't know. Another conversation for another day, perhaps. But
yeah, indeed.
But yeah. Nicki deserves. I think that's a great spot.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap things up, were there's any other honorable mentions or anyone else that we didn't capture that you think would be good?
I think we got into all of it.
I think we did too. One honorable mention that I do want to highlight, I consider putting this person for the artist like number one, but Billie Eilish had a pretty strong year.
Absolutely.
I mean, I definitely, I know it's like the end of the pod now, but I did want to mention that, you know, at least from what I checked last on Polymarket, the odds-on favorite for album of the year was Hit Me Hard and Soft, that album. And the tour, you know, she's been doing some really strong numbers there, and you know, 5 shows at the Kia Forum in Inglewood. She probably could have done a stadium show there if she wanted to. She did a bunch of shows in New York. I think she's going to do 6 shows in O2 Arena next year.
So, I was at one of her garden shows.
Oh, you did mention that.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, and I think her ability, you know, her songs aren't like necessarily the most peppy, upbeat, traditional arena type bangers, but man, could she hold that crowd, and people were just zoned in. I mean, she put on such a fantastic show, and you know, it wasn't like over the top with a zillion backup dancers or anything like that, but she just really she's got great stage presence. The music is fantastic. So she deserves a ton of credit as well. And I think so much attention is on Taylor Swift, you know, at sort of the top of the pop world, that, you know, let's say Billie Eilish, Olivia Rodrigo, who had both great years, great tours, great albums, you know, don't get maybe as much shine as they would in a normal year. But yeah, Olivia Rodrigo too, I think, deserves a ton of credit. Just another fantastic performer I saw at the Garden, and a great follow-up album to like a pretty hard to beat first album. I think those two strong honorable mention for you know, artist winner of the year, artist of the year in our own like, you know, two person award show committee.
Right. And I mean, both under 25, you know, doing their thing, you know, plenty of runway in their careers. Yeah. Well, Zach, this was great. Appreciate you coming on. And yeah, glad we got to do this in person.
Yes, sir. As always.